So what do we want to do if we need to gather information on a research question that we want to find a rich description of a person's lived experience? We use a qualitative method. And today we're looking at qualitative interviews. And qualitative versus quantitative, the studies and the research that we've looked at that uses statistics are quantitative data. And qualitative means more quality. We want to understand like I said, the person's lived experience, and it's an interaction between an interviewer and the participant, where we can gain that rich understanding of a certain phenomenon to answer our question. We may or may not have specific questions that we're asking, and we may or may not use those questions in a specific order. It can be thought of as a purposeful conversation. It allows us to understand just the rich, more complex processes of the hows involving human beings. Qualitative interviews can be the sole way we gather data, or we can use it along with quantitative research techniques as in a mixed methodology to gather our data to answer our research questions and test our hypotheses. It allows research to understand the subject's perspectives. Qualitative research is very valid. It really digs deep, several layers deep in many cases, to answer that research question. And it's not necessarily reliable. This is a person's lived experience or a group of people's lived experience, but it is less reliable because it's harder to generalize to other populations. But we can start generating really rich meaning that allows us to take that information and use it for further study in other populations to start developing some reliability. These interviews can gather first-hand accounts of their impressions and the person's phenomenology or lived experience, and can also be used to understand how people feel about their roles and identities in society. One of the most important things within qualitative research is our interview schedule. We may have a structured, semi-structured, unstructured, focus group types of interviews, and we really need to look at how we're going to ask those questions. Within structured interview questions, it's very structured. One question, next question, next question, for all participants. There may be some structured follow-up questions, but it's all pre-planned. A semi-structured is a combination of pre-planned and unplanned, where you might have 5 questions, but based on those 5 questions that you ask all participants, you may have some follow-up questions and prodding questions and things like that, where they can start developing more information based on those 5 main questions, so these sub-questions. So that's semi-structured interviews. Unstructured interviews are the most open style of interviewing. It's basically sitting down with a person, no plan really necessary. It provides a good depth, breadth, and a good interaction between the people. It's a conversational tone. So you can have these informal chats with your participants, but also you can have an interview guide where it covers areas, but based on how the person is answering, we might formulate our questions around that, how the person is answering. So there's no definite answers going in, or questions going in, but there are kind of a guide. So if we want to go interview somebody who is a serial killer per se, we're not going to necessarily go in there and ask them about cookies and baking and what car they drive, unless that's part of relevance in the study. But we're going to want to know about how they grew up and things like that, and then formulate our questions based on how they answered and how we can dig into the rich meaning of how they developed into the serial killer. So focus groups typically will have about 6 to 12 people engaged in a group discussion around a topic. These again can be very formal, with structured questions and semi-structured questions, but they can also be fairly informal. So it's basically like taking the the prior interview schedules and applying them to a group of people. So we might set, 10 people who were victim of assault in the last year in a room and ask them questions about their experience related to the neighborhood, their safety, what may have prevented it, and things like that. So if we're using an interview style where there isn't a lot of predetermined questions, we want to go in with a good outline of the different areas that we want to hit, because we don't want to hit or miss anything important. Also, how we ask the questions is almost as important as the different topic areas, because we can really actually, not getting information is better than getting wrong information in the vast majority of cases. For example, if you're going to ask somebody a question, well, you didn't think about killing them, did you? Right there is showing that I'm judging the person, but it also is a leading question. I don't want them to say yes, I want them to say no. Or I could ask it the opposite way. So you probably thought about killing them, didn't you? And that could bias the question, and they might be more likely to give an affirmative answer in that situation. So making sure you're not asking too complex of questions, you're clear and concise with your questions, much like the survey question. When you're doing qualitative interviews, we want to get as rich a data and as in depth of data and as much data as possible, so we can go back with all this data and we start narrowing it down to themes. And part of the way we get all that rich data, say we might only have 10 questions, and there might just be very short answers. So what we want to do is use probing questions. We want to get people, or not necessarily probing questions, but probing statements. And that's to get people to elaborate on what they said. It's kind of like the downward arrow where, and then what, 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 and then we can get to the root of some of the issues. So probes are meant to get the person to elaborate on the responses, and you can use simple statements like, tell me more. That's interesting. Okay. So giving that head nod, just asking, can you clarify that? Can you expand on that? So those are simple, but they're very useful. And if you don't practice them, sometimes they're hard to do. So when you're doing research in a qualitative fashion, you want to decide, are you an insider or are you an outsider? Are you an outside researcher, or are you a person that is going to implant themselves into the culture and to spend a significant amount of time? In some cases, especially with anthropology, if you look at people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, they spent months and years with the people that they're studying, and they generated fabulous qualitative research. So we really want to decide, which way we're going to do. For the most part, we're going to be an outsider. We're not going to be somebody who embeds themselves into the culture of the participants that we're trying to study. But anyway, to gain access to the people we're trying to study, because qualitative research is very intimate in a lot of respects. It takes a lot of trust. Where it's easy to fill a survey, you can do it anonymously. But with qualitative research, you're sitting face to face with the researcher, and that can be quite intimidating. So you want to get the buy-in from the people on top of that organization. So if you're going to go do qualitative research on the gangs in Chicago, you're going to want to talk to gang leaders. If you're going to do a study on a prison, you're going to want to talk to the warden or the superintendent. But it's best to find this person. This person is called a sponsor. A lot of times we'll engage in, we'll identify the sponsor, write a letter about our intent, follow up with a phone call, schedule a meeting, and if we get that buy-in from the top, a lot of times the people towards the bottom, not the bottom, but the participants that we want to get this data on are going to accept us. So gaining the sponsor allows us to gain rapport with our research participants. So conducting qualitative interviews, we want to, most often we want to do it in person. It's the most common way. But also we can do it online, over the phone, and you can also do qualitative interviews through a survey where you might ask a question, and then based on what they answer, you could have follow-up kind of questions, kind of like that survey format that we were talking about last week. But with a qualitative survey, they're open-ended questions, and you're going to generate hopefully more rich data than a simple Likert scale or a yes/no closed-ended types of or short answer questions. So what happens when you gather all your data, you enter the computer, you generate your themes, and you think, holy man, I forgot to totally ask about their living situation when they were a young adult or something. And we might think, well, let's just publish it based on what we have. No, you're going to want to go back and ask some follow-up questions. So it's really good to get participants that are open to you coming back for follow-up questions. With focus groups, we want to be aware of groupthink. A good example of groupthink is when the Challenger spaceship crashed in the mid-1980s. There were some people that believed that there was a fault in whatever piece of equipment faulted and then made the spaceship blow up. But they kept quiet because they were listening to the other people, and the other people were saying, you know, yep, it's ready, yep, it's ready, yep, it's ready, yep, it's ready. But these people didn't feel confident enough. And it might have been just one person kind of knew what was going on, but he didn't say anything because all these established professionals said, nope, it's good. And, you know, and of course it blew up. Happens in juries and things like that, where you might have some very dominant people in that jury, and yet there's a couple people that, you know, truly believe this person is innocent or guilty, but they're keeping quiet because everybody else feels so passionately and is so loud about the person's innocence or guilt. And that happens when we're doing qualitative research. That happens, you know, if we sit around a group of a table of people who might be victims of domestic abuse, and there might be individuals that are very outspoken, and then there certainly might be people that, and it could be any crime, not just domestic abuse, but there might be people that are quiet and don't say anything. Well, these people that are quiet and don't say anything, they're just as important as the people that are dominating all the time. So we want to make sure that when we're doing that, we're spreading around the questions and making sure that everybody has their chance to give their feedback, because no one person's feedback is more important than another's. And so another example of something you need to be, or not an example, but another thing you need to be aware of when you're doing group research is that the groups might be, and this is where I was going with the domestic assault, might be of a sensitive nature, and some people might not want to admit certain things that have happened to them in front of other people. So there's, for one, a risk to confidentiality when they're in a group, so they're going to want to sign off on talking about that. And you're going to really want to make sure that they don't provide information that isn't true, for one. So if you go around and ask, you know, have you ever been abused? And, you know, they might want to say no because they don't want the other people to know. But also, if the first 5 people say yes, 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 that person might have pressure, the next person might have pressure to say yes. So you really want to be careful on how you ask the questions and how you structure the focus groups. So it's usually best to get an audio tape of what we are, our interview, so we can write it down exactly, word for word, what the person says. Verbatim, word for word. Research that I did, I put it into the computer word for word off the transcripts. I had 16 interviews, and I looked at the different, every sentence went into a theme. So if they're talking about housing, I put that into a file where they talked about housing. If they talked about income, I put it into a different file. If they talked about their criminal offense, I put it into a different file. And then from those different files, then I sub-coded. So you want to code things as much as possible so you can come up with themes that are generated. But even when you do individual interviews, you want to make sure that nobody is monopolizing the data.